It's nice to see you all again. And what I thought about, what I would talk about is hopefully something that would be useful to my old academic friends. Uh, and I wanted to talk about two things based on my own experience in industry. And I'm not going to claim that that experience is representative of everything that happens, but I was trained to think like some of the people in this room. And maybe how I thought of supply chains as an economist might be useful. So two things I wanted to talk about are first, supply chains made me think about what is the definition of a firm. If you look at a standard economic model, uh, a lot of what we wrap up in a supply chain is just a production function. And that abstracts from a lot of things that are really important in terms of the actual operation of the firm. And then and I'm going to emphasize, how thinking of this as a rather complicated, dynamic, stochastic program is at least a language I was used to think of it. I'm not going to write down that model, but I'm going to talk about some metaphors. And then the second thing I want to talk about is something that I do for my work almost every day for the last 14 years now, is how to try and optimize these supply chains in practice and make them run in a more effective manner. So let me start with the first thing. So if I go to empirical IO and I think of a benchmark model, it might be something like Bertrand price competition on top of a logistics system, and then there's some sort of cost function or production function in the background. And it strikes me that when we do our work, there's a lot of emphasis on what happens between the firm and the consumer. Like if I open up Tirol's textbook or go to the NBER IO meetings, we're usually looking at a lot of things involving pricing, marketing, tariffs that might be set between the consumer and the firm. And I'm not saying everywhere, but as a general rule, we spend a lot less time talking about what happens before the product arrives to the consumer. And a lot of the action within a firm is exactly the opposite. You usually have 5% of your people might be focused on pricing and marketing exercise, and 70–80% of your people might be focused on making the firm operate and getting the products to the customers. I want to give you an example that I've been thinking about a lot lately. I want to be careful about talking about any given firm. But I'm going to give you an example of what a supply chain looks like from something I'm doing currently, which is a vaccine manufacturer. I'm not going to say who, but they produce a seasonal vaccine. You can think of something like a flu vaccine as a metaphor. And here's how I think of their supply chain. And when I talk to them, I hear them communicate with me about it. It's something like a 9-month to a 3-year planning cycle for them. So in the start of the year, maybe March, they need to procure chemicals, materials, chemicals and materials for producing the product. They get into April, May, they will go to something called a CMO, contracted manufacturing organization, because they're only producing for part of the year. They will just rent their manufacturing capability. Some will be vertically integrated, but a lot will be rented. They'll need to, because workers take time to get, they'll need to build a labor force and hire seasonal workers for that. Then come about August, July, August, they will begin manufacturing. The August through maybe November, December, manufacturing will run, and they will be transporting the product from, let's say, a manufacturing facility to a place that holds inventory. And then you need to go from your inventory to, let's say, a doctor's office or a pharmacy. And if you think about this, this is when you watch them in practice, this requires a lot of coordination and scheduling among really tens of thousands of people. And that's what makes it hard to operate a firm, is getting everybody pointed in the same direction to act in a coordinated manner. And in addition, the types of shocks that can happen to these firms. So, you can think of the word supply chain is actually very visually appealing, because this is like a chain. It's a set of linkages that needs to happen in order to actually get the product to the customer. And if one of those segments fails, they may not be able to get the product to the customer at all. If they are unable to get workers, let's say, how are you going to manufacture? Or if you can't procure the materials, the problems there. So in economics, we talk a lot about risk and uncertainty. But from the viewpoint of the firm, just imagine yourself as a CEO or a manager dealing with this. You're going to think about risk very differently right now. You have a sequence of events that all need to go right, that could all be hit by various shocks. And if one of those shocks is big enough, it can really disrupt your ability to match supply to demand, the amount of product you're going to make to the amount of products that customers want to buy. So I could sit down and write the sequence of events I just talked about as a dynamic program. And if you're an operations research person in the back end of the firm, some components of that problem you would write down in that way, and they would use that for planning. But this is sort of a sequence of events where there are changes in your state variable, changes in your information, external shocks that can hit. Now I want to talk about on this, if you had this model of a firm in your head, how you would think about some very basic economics differently. Like, what do our economic models do for us? They help us to determine prices, quantities, margins, things like that. Those are the dependent variables in our models. And everybody here knows what those logics look like. Like in an IO model, just to grossly simplify, your prices are usually something like the cost plus a markup term that depends upon your differentiation. Let me tell you just how that logic might completely fall apart if you begin to think of the world this way. Think of some of the shocks that we've seen over the last few years. Suppose your transportation network breaks down, like the port of LA being backed up 80 or 100 ships deep, or you're unable to get trucking, or there is problems with materials. The auto companies experience this with chips. Or suppose you're in the middle of producing and you get hit with COVID, which can be a huge negative or positive demand shock for your good. So you're rolling down this chain, and all of a sudden a disruption occurs. Well, now you're going to behave in a completely different manner. Like, let's suppose that the disruption is you get hit with COVID and demand falls drastically. What are you going to do as a firm? You have way too much product relative to how much consumers want. All the previous costs are now sunk. You've made the product. This is now a optimal, in operations research, they call these like optimal recovery problems. Like, how much revenue can you actually get from consumers given that you are oversupplied relative to the market? And if you write one of those problems down, like you have a perishable good, and 4 or 5 months before it expires, you're going to start out with your prices a little bit higher and cascade them down in a way that is revenue maximizing. Note that things like the prior costs don't even enter into those formulas, right? Like the stuff we normally think about, that's all sunk. That's water under the bridge. On the opposite side, suppose you get hit by a different type of shock, like you have too little product, the port shut down, you can't get enough truckers. Well, then you have a situation where the available demand might far outstrip supply. And then it's an optimal recovery problem in the opposite direction. You're going to ration the amount that you put out into the market so that you don't run out of inventory too quickly by selling it too cheaply. And there might also be in these things, you see firms do this, some form of brand reputation or long-term relationships with customers where they don't want to get, let's say, too aggressive with these formulas. So just as a thought experiment, I was trying to evoke what the solutions to this as a dynamic program might look like as a metaphor, but compare it to your standard, let's say, Bertrand competition type of IO model. How's it different? The upstream costs in the presence of a shock are almost irrelevant. Cost function that we markups relative to marginal costs, that's not the game in the presence of a large shock. The quantities are predetermined, right? They've been determined upstream in the chain, and you might be really long or short, particularly in the presence of shocks. When you try to explain prices, well, the prices will depend upon are you long or short relative to the amount that the market needs, and what's the size of that magnitude, so that this might be something useful for you in looking at industries. I was talking to people at the Federal Reserve the other week about inflation. This way of thinking of what a firm does might help us understand some fairly primitive and basic concepts. So my apologies for not writing everything down in a model. That would be a lot of work, but hopefully I've conveyed part of the flavor of what it looks like when you're inside of a firm and how decisions look to them. The second thing I want to talk about, and I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly and give a chance to ask a few questions, is when you get inside of a firm, optimization is really important. Uh, but most of the optimization happens in the back end of the company. And this process of trying to get everybody coordinated, procuring the right amount of materials, organizing your transportation and logistics. Uh, these are when you start to think about them and write them down, these are very high dimensional control problems. Things that, quite candidly, we don't even have the ability to solve. A practical example I was going to give to people, one that I worked on a lot, was inventory. Uh, uh, the firm I just got done working for assorted tens of millions of unique products. And for every one of those products, you need to determine how much do you want on your shelves and where do you want to put it. So uh, that is really billions of decisions. If I have 200, 500 separate locations where I might store the product, I have hundreds of millions of products say it's 20 million products, so I need to have choose different inventory levels. I have to do this continuously through the year. This is really billions of decisions. How do firms do it in practice? In my experience, just to paint a really, really, really broad brush, uh, you either use heuristics or you try to optimize. And here I'm talking specifically about inventory. So if you were inside of Target, let's say, there might be somebody who is the manager for, let's say, women's clothing, and they may go off, build a spreadsheet, and say, well, I would like to cover demand with 85% probability. There'll be systems that will forecast the demand at a product level, but they need to determine how much inventory they want to have, and they'll do it by something like a rule of thumb. This number is called the critical ratio for folks that have ever been exposed to inventory theory. And that might be the job of the managers to determine the critical ratio, and then they throw it over the fence to their tech and operations teams who try to hit that target. A second way you might do this is to think of it as a full-blown optimization problem. If you were, let's say, doing route planning in transportation, open up Powell's book sometime on approximate dynamic programming. They sit down and they explicitly model these things as high dimensional dynamic optimizations. And that's because there are big returns from trying to solve those things better. In my experience, I always kind of use thinking of the firm trying to maximize some present value metric as a North Star. Like that's what you'd really like to do. But then you realize it's a little hard to do that perfectly. So what you try to do is find practical approximations. And you try to experiment and get a little bit better every day. So this is almost similar to how like people run a search engine. That might be a more familiar example. Like when somebody trains a search engine, you have a metric, like might be conversion. They train a model, which might be a deep learning model of clicks. They make a decision how to rank things, then they go out and test it, and they go back to the start. In a supply chain example, your metric might be something like uh, a sum of short run, indirect, and long run effects. So your short run might be something like profitability at a SKU level. An example of an indirect effect is if you have more inventory in the network, you might reduce transportation costs. And an example of a long run effect is if you go out of stock, your customers aren't going to be very happy and they might not want to come back. So in practice, you might put in some effort and try to build up practical placeholders to this. This is really decision theory. Then what's the next thing you do? Well, you'd form a set of forecasts. There's been a lot of progress there. If they wanted to be fancy, Target might throw like a deep learning transformer model on stuff. Predicting demand accurately at like 1 to 10 weeks is gotten a lot better. Third thing you might do is some form of optimization. You might start out by having simpler formulas for optimization, like if you've ever seen Ken Arrow's old Newsboy model, you might use some solutions like that, or you might be fancy. And then the last thing you're going to do is probably deploy it in the field and test it. And in my experience, what you try to do is just get a little bit better every week and month. Because if you can make this process 3% more efficient in a year, over a course of a decade, you're 35, 40% more efficient, right? Like these effects compound. And economists think of firms as solving these problems sometimes full blown right up front. But what you're usually trying to do is recognize that these problems are really hard, but do each one of these steps a little bit better every day to improve some things. And the last thing I wanted to do is, this is part of the transformation I see happening in industry with what they would call digitization in supply chain. Like, why would you use try to go down this path of solving the optimization problems rather than just heuristics? There's a few reasons why. First one is models get better over time. Your forecasts get better. Your metrics to measure your returns get better. But rules of thumb really don't get better. And if you rely only on rules of thumb, what happens is your firm and your code base become just this clutter of rules of thumb. And it ends up not being a logically coherent way to approach the problem. There's all sorts of strange things that can happen. A second reason to go this way is if different parts of the back end of the company are operating off of same or similar metrics, like the one I mentioned, they're not going to fight each other. Like, what's one of the lessons of game theory? If you give people different metrics, you can have terrible and sometimes surprising outcomes. But if you give them the same metric, they're at least trying to row in the same direction. With the approach I described, in a way, you're really taking your decisions and you're trying to turn them into a factory. You're trying to standardize them. And there's a lot of benefits from standardizing your decisions rather than making them continuously ad hoc. Learning how to do these things well is something that has really huge productivity implications for a firm. Like if I look at the last firm I worked for, they had 15% prime shipments or something when I first came in. And now they regularly deliver things to you in a day or less. Without this type of, really dedication to measurement, standardization, optimization, experimentation, and testing, you never would get there. It's just too hard to get the inefficiencies out of the system. So great, I'll stop there, and my apologies for not being able to show you my slides. But uh, uh, yeah, I hope some of this is useful. I just wanted to try and spark your thinking a little bit about how you might have thought of the world if you sat in my job for the last decade.